Hey everyone, I just wanted to welcome you on behalf of the New Inquiry and Verso. Thank you, Verso, for having us in this space. And also on behalf of Bronx Climate Justice and Grassroots and NYC. And I just have a couple announcements. So in addition to tonight's event, some of you might have been at the women's strike meeting beforehand that was also held in this space. And they're interested in no DAPL actions as well. So if you're trying to connect or link up with them, and we're all going to link up in different ways together, there's actually an email on the whiteboard, so you can do so that way. And there's also some flyers around the room, or you can come to us with questions. Dan is also coordinating an action that day for the women's strike on March 8th. So if you have any questions about that, you can go to Dan. On behalf of the New Inquiry, we're having a letter writing event for prisoners who are suffering retaliation from the prison strike. And that's happening tomorrow at the Mayday space in Bushwick at 4 p.m. So if that's of interest to you, that's another event that we're also hosting. And then if you want to follow this on Twitter, the hashtag is NYC Divest. And if you're interested in following the live stream or have a friend who couldn't be here tonight who'd like to do so, that live stream will be on the Verso Facebook page. This event will also be filmed, so if there's someone who wants to watch it after the fact, it's going to be recorded, not just live streamed in the present and erased. So it's good to know. And let's see, is there anything else that I'm forgetting? I think that's it.
Great. So I was just going to say, start with sad news, which is that Judith LeBlanc, the director of the Native Organizers Alliance, will not be able to come tonight because we pushed back the time. So she unfortunately won't be there, but it's going to be great anyway. And I'm going to hand it off to Audrea, who is a journalist who writes on resource extraction and indigenous rights. And let the panel begin.
Hi. Is this on? Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Audrea Lim. I'm a journalist, and I write on some of these issues of energy and the environment and local resistance, indigenous resistance to pipelines and developments. And yeah, thanks to everybody for coming today. I'm just gonna begin by having everybody introduce themselves and just say one or two things about the kind of organizing work or the kind of issues they've been focusing on. And maybe what you guys think are, what's like the most important thing that you've been trying to focus on.
All right, there we go. Hi, my name is Ann Spice. I'm a Tlingit member of the Kwanlin First Nation, which is in the Yukon Territory in so-called Canada. Let me think for a second here. I think that the pieces of the work that I think are most important and what I've been mostly working on is supporting Indigenous frontline resistance movements. And so my political and also academic work is with primarily the Unistoten clan of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, which is in northern BC. And so I've been engaged with anti-pipeline struggle for quite a while now, and also indigenous movements for indigenous sovereignty over territory. So I'm really interested in thinking about how we frame climate justice and how we frame environmental movements in ways that respect Indigenous leadership, and the kind of coalition building we can be doing both in the city and in other spaces to sort of bring our struggles together, both against resource extraction and pipeline development and also capitalism.
And you do some organizing work in New York City for...
Yeah, okay, I'll introduce that piece too. So I'm also a member of the NYC Stands with Standing Rock Collective, which is a group of scholars and students in the city, both native and non-native supporters, who we formed in late August to help show solidarity for Standing Rock in New York. And so we've been arranging rallies and teach-ins, and we see our work primarily there as doing educating work to try and help people understand the history and context of struggles like Standing Rock, so that we can sort of place that in a longer history of resistance.
Hey everyone, my name is Patrick Robbins. I am the co-director of Sane Energy Project, which is a grassroots climate organization based here in New York that is fighting for a fully renewable New York City and New York State. And our work is focused on sort of twofold. One, fostering the kind of transition to renewable energy that we want to see and setting a standard for social justice around issues like offshore wind power, which is something that we are currently focusing on very heavily in our work, while also remaining rooted in the fight against fossil fuel infrastructure, which is how I came into this work and how Sane Energy Project sort of came into existence through fighting the Spectra Energy's pipeline in the West Village in 2012. I was a coordinator for Occupy the Pipeline, which was at the time a sort of sister organization to Sane Energy Project that was coordinating nonviolent direct action at the pipeline site in the West Village, and have continued resistance to Spectra Energy through the Resist Spectra campaign, which has been waging a campaign of civil disobedience to the construction of a giant 42-inch high-pressure gas pipeline that is located only 105 feet from critical Indian Point nuclear power plant safety infrastructure up in Westchester. And that's, I think, how I got to know Audrea. And I've been doing, I guess that from what I've seen, the most important function that I think we serve is similar to what Anne was saying about not only bringing people into the movement and building a broad movement, but building a movement with an analysis that is accurate and commensurate to the crisis, as well as tactics that are commensurate to the crisis as well.
My name is Kate Aronoff. I'm a writing fellow at NYC Times magazine, where I've covered the election and transition of Donald Trump's administration. One of my main beats is climate politics. I also co-host a podcast on Dissent magazine called Hot and Bothered. My background is in climate organizing, so it's a particularly interesting moment right now to be covering climate politics and also just seeing sort of the way folks in the movement are kind of responding to this moment. So I helped start a fossil fuel divestment campaign at my college and continued to stay involved with that movement for many, many years, co-founded something called the Fossil Fuel Divestment Student Network. And so I'm interested and curious tonight to hear how folks are thinking about this tactic in relation to something like Standing Rock and to some of what have been the most hopeful, I think, struggles of the last several years when we think about the climate, as well as the sort of number of issues that are adjacent to something like the fights over the Keystone XL pipeline and Standing Rock. And so my work in the last several weeks and months has been focused on both trying to tell stories about what's actually happening on the front lines of these struggles, and just what this transition looks like and what it means. And so in sort of thinking about that as kind of an aggregate, I think one of the most important things going forward is just not to lose sight of the fact that both the climate movement itself and the left more generally seems to be actually in a stronger place than it's been for a very long time. And one of the more kind of subtle implications of Donald Trump's administration, beyond the fact that all of the sort of horrible climate impacts that are more likely now that he's in office, is losing sight of the fact that we actually still need to be demanding the things we were thinking about before Donald Trump was elected, and when we were thinking of having a kind of baseline of a neoliberal Democrat in office who we thought we could push. And so, yeah, I think particularly as a journalist, I think one of the most important things I am interested in doing now is not losing sight of the fact that there are still people out there, still people really demanding this, and who are doing more than just sort of defensive work. That this isn't just a defensive fight. That there are folks really demanding what is the world we need, what is a world beyond Donald Trump and all of the sort of horrible implications his administration spells out.
Okay, so I guess one of the things that I think we could begin with is just to look at how, I mean, both the environmental movement and like the indigenous movement in the United States have really just like ballooned in the last few years. And I'm wondering what we're beginning to see come out of it, what strategies have worked to help bring people into the movement so far, and maybe what we need to work on, just based on your experience as like organizers or people who are, you know, trying to talk about it to a broader audience.
Okay, I can start there. I think for me, I mean, I can talk about what I've seen that has not worked, and maybe I'll start with the negative and move to the positive. One of the things we see on the front lines of indigenous movements for sovereignty is the attempt for environmental organizations to kind of parachute in and control the agenda of what's happening in those spaces. And every time I've seen, with good intentions, right? So every time I've seen that happen, where we have environmental organizations who come in with a certain kind of framework about how they're run and how they do things, and they come into indigenous spaces without really thinking through what it might mean to answer to indigenous leadership, I've never really seen that work out very well. So I think for me, the question is less about how to bring people in to the climate movement and more about how people who are not part of the communities that are most marginalized by climate change, how folks can be reaching out in a way that's offering something of value to people who've been like fighting on the front lines for a number of years now.
Just one quick clarifying question. What exactly is indigenous sovereignty? And I mean, the environmental movement and like the indigenous movement come at, say, the issue of pipelines from slightly different places. And I don't think that's entirely clear to a lot of people, so.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, we can use Standing Rock as one of the examples here. A lot of people from the outside saw the fight at Standing Rock as primarily about the Dakota Access Pipeline. One of the things that people on the ground were emphasizing again and again is that it's not just about a pipeline, and it's not just about that one pipeline either, that in order to adequately fight these resource extraction projects, we need a broad frame that takes really seriously indigenous histories on the territory, that takes seriously a fight for indigenous sovereignty, which is about self-determination for indigenous nations and a recognition of people's political rights. And so not just about like, what can we do to stop the pipeline and sort of using indigenous people in their position on the land as a kind of tool for that, but actually starting from a point of recognizing indigenous title, recognizing the history of treaties and the breaking of treaties on these territories, and then looking to political leadership in indigenous nations to move forward with that fight.
I would definitely agree with what Anne just said in terms of what has worked and what has not worked over the course of the last several years, and in particular over the course of the last year. And I think that more broadly, when you see the grassroots setting the terms and the goals of the campaign itself and the momentum that's growing, that is when you see transformative victories. So taking an example here in New York State, the grassroots groups and groups of neighbors that lived in the southern tier were actually the ones pushing for a ban on fracking long before any of the environmental organizations. And that was a goal that was considered politically a non-starter. And it was through basically sticking to their guns and continuing to drill home that that's going to be the goal or there is not going to be a goal. Like, that's what moved those other larger organizations to that place and how we were actually able to achieve that victory. So when we talk about the environmental movement ballooning, I think it's important to talk about who in the environmental movement, considered very, very broadly, is benefiting. I have some trepidation that the numbers of people and the funding that is now streaming into some of these organizations is actually, if anything, furthering pre-existing inequalities of resources within the environmental movement, since larger NGOs are better positioned to take advantage of that wave of momentum. And we're not going to survive if we don't change that dynamic.
And what would happen if what will happen if more money is streaming into NGOs? What's the danger there?
Well, I think the danger there is that you start seeing larger organizations setting the agenda and setting terms that are not in accordance or following the lead of the grassroots groups and are not actually adequate to the problem at hand. And that's, I could name any number of examples. I think that the Clean Power Plan would be one such example, where you are actually not setting goals that set you up for the kind of long-term base building and organizing that you need to sustain a movement. And it's just a different institutional culture, I guess.
And what is the Clean Power Plan?
I'm sorry, this is a national plan that was sort of allocating and mandating different state-based approaches to limiting carbon emissions.
Oh, and one more question. A lot of these local communities that you've been working with, they're obviously interested in making sure that their water and air remains clean, but are there other things that the communities that you've organized around are concerned about?
Beyond water and air?
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a range of concerns. Just speaking from my own experience organizing against the Spectra pipeline over the last over a year, there are concerns around emissions. All natural gas, fracked gas infrastructure emits benzene, carcinogens. You see increased in asthma rates and cancer rates in areas surrounding compressor stations and pipelines. And the risk of explosions is something that's, ever present on the minds of the people that live right in that affected area. I have been privileged to work with a woman named Courtney Williams, who some of you have met, who has a daughter in the elementary school that's 400 feet from where the pipeline is being built. And I've never seen anyone fight anything as hard as I have seen Courtney fight this pipeline, because there is that direct stake,
Well, I would agree with most all of that. But I think there's been a huge transformation in a very specific tier of the climate movement. And I think when we talk about the climate movement, it's important to sort of define terms a little bit. And I think in a lot of cases, that refers to a pretty specific set of demands, a pretty specific set of organizations, and is often talked about in sort of different terms than environmental justice fights, for instance, which tend to be very rooted in communities facing toxic impacts, by and large led by working class folks of color. And so, I came to climate organizing as a freshman in college, and that was 2010, I think. And at that point, most of the demands that I was seeing on campus, most of them coming from larger green organizations, were about changing light bulbs and recycling and making sure we didn't have styrofoam in our dining hall, all of which are fine things to demand, but seemed a little bit out of step with the scale of the crisis. And I think since then, there's been this real push from below, from grassroots organizers, to really reconsider what does fighting climate change mean, and that's come in a couple different forms. Part of it is seems like folks from the Global South at international climate negotiations hosted by the UN saying we need 1.5 degrees to survive. And this isn't a matter of consumption choices. This isn't a matter of changing the way we live our lifestyles. This is a matter of survival for many people. And many people not just in the Global South, but in our own country as well. And I think this sort of came to a head in something like the Keystone XL fight, led by indigenous communities along the pipeline's route, and sort of demanding a really refocusing of what does this mean when we talk about climate. And I think part of that too happened to coincide with things like Occupy Wall Street and infusing the climate fight with this real anti-corporate fervor, which it hadn't had before, for a whole host of reasons and organizational decisions on the part of very large green organizations, which is the subject of a whole other talk. But I think what's worked is that pushing from below to really reconsider, not the sort of basic demand that climate change is important, but that we need to reground this not just in talking about different sorts of gases which are leaking into the atmosphere, but in basic human needs. And I think the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline really does this so well, which is saying water is life, and there's really nothing more basic than that. And I think when you're operating at that level, it's much easier to make sort of organic connections to other movements, to other struggles, because they're not abstract connections for many people to make. I was talking to someone who works with an environmental justice organization in Irvine, California, which is sort of surrounded by oil wells, by fracking sites increasingly, and has between the first and second worst air quality in California, depending on the month. It's surrounded sort of on all sides by mountains, and so all these toxins that sort of come up from the extractive process, you just sit above this town, which is largely has a very large undocumented population. A lot of folks work on fields. There's a mayor there who is 23, was elected on a platform of getting rid of the fossil fuel industry in the town, which other folks who have been in that position before were unwilling to do. And so I was talking to someone who worked on his campaign, and he said, well, part of what governing really looks like for someone who's for folks who are dealing with these toxic impacts is it's not just working against the fossil fuel industry. It's not just working to redress some of these really toxic impacts. He said it's very clear for some folks. If I was paraphrasing someone, he said, if I have a problem with my green card, I can't help you bring down methane emissions. And so really, if we're talking about what this looks like on the ground, those connections are very apparent and organic in a way that I think can sometimes get abstracted when you talk about these at a sort of 30,000 feet level. So I think that's kind of what's working is grounding this in folks who are dealing with this in an organic way and not trying to make sort of intellectual connections between these issues.
Right, so one of the things that I'm hearing everybody sort of talk about is how issues of like racial inequality or class inequality or the issue of like who gets to decide what the climate movement looks like, or who gets to set the agenda about it, how these are sort of like it's the main issue really right now. So I'm kind of wondering how, what would it mean or what do we have to do to sort of push the climate movement in a direction that sort of reflects that it's about racial inequality or so that it's about like energy justice or, that it deals with these issues.
We don't have to go in order.
I'll just say very simply, funneling resources towards organizations that are led by communities of color and grassroots frontline communities. I think that resource flow can look like lots of things, most importantly, actual money, but also, training and access and knowledge of the political landscape, if you can afford to have people that are actually, doing that 24/7, putting those resources at the disposal of communities that are dealing with fossil fuel infrastructure firsthand is one very simple step that just comes to my mind.
I can go. I mean, I think one thing might be just kind of getting rid of the getting rid of the idea of a climate movement as sort of a distinct entity, as something which, sort of stands alone and has its own set of demands. One of the real barriers, it seems like, to, getting popular support for a climate movement for real federal, state level action on climate is that some of the most recognizable faces of it are folks like Leonardo DiCaprio or Elon Musk or Al Gore, who, live lives that are very different from most of us who are sitting in this room. And so I think part of it is just, about really grounding in what does it actually mean to, take on climate change earnestly? What does it mean to do this? And I think part of what that is actually could mean a better life for a lot of people. When we talk about, the level of transition needed to scale up renewables, for instance, that's could be potentially millions of jobs. I mean, not to take sort of Chinese governmental figures, but the government of China just released a plan to create 13 million jobs in the renewable sector, which is a lot. And we have Donald Trump talking about creating hundreds of jobs at a time. This is a scale of transition which is much, a scale of job creation, which is beyond anything we've really seen in this country. It's just one example, for instance. But yeah, I think maybe getting out of the idea that the climate movement itself is something which does not have really material connections to economic transformations and other sorts of social transformations as well.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with both of those things, and also just add that on a kind of theoretical level that it's important when we're describing the work that we're doing, when we're figuring out what kind of language we can use to help include more people in sort of what we consider as the climate movement, that we recognize that the framework of a kind of generalizable solidarity that's about unity, that we're all coming from the same place, we're all in this together, the climate affects us all. I really think that narrative doesn't work for us because we're not all coming from the same place, and the climate does not affect us all in the same way. And I think that we need to push against that in really specific ways, that actually documenting and raising up and sort of, speaking, having platforms for voices coming from frontline communities, documenting the actual connections that people have with, environmental degradation in different places, and making sure that those are elevated in our discussion. I think that's just incredibly important, and it also takes it out of the realm of the abstract, which I think is also crucial. That people need to be thinking about what our impacts are on communities in New York, not in a sort of big generalizable way, but what are the communities that are facing, environmental racism in this city, and then how does that connect into our fight for alternatives? And so I think in terms of the narrative that we have, that there's also a kind of important theoretical background to that, which is about the kinds of words we're using and the way that we describe what the movement is meant to do.
I think another way of parsing a little bit of that distinction that you're talking about, and in terms of different stakes that different people have in this issue, is the renewable jobs piece. And I don't think that it's often articulated in that way. I sometimes get annoyed when I see these periodic studies come out that say there's now 5 times as many jobs in the clean energy sector as there are in the fossil fuel sector, which is true, but it's also a kind of useless piece of information unless there's actual organizing happening at the rank and file level around those jobs.
Well, I think something else to add is just that a lot of those times those jobs aren't very good. Right. I mean, I talking to pipeline workers who are actually many times the same workers who are building wind turbines and who are installing solar panels. They get their work through unions which contract out both to fossil fuel companies and to renewables companies. And so the jobs building pipelines are actually it's well-paid work. You can make up to 6 figures working for less than a year. And so I think, in talking about not just green jobs as this kind of blanket demand, but actually making sure those jobs are good, making sure they're unionized, and making sure that people actually want to do them. And for that, I think we need to talk about more than just the figures of how many of those jobs are being created.
I'm wondering about you mentioned New York City, and I think one of the big things about the climate movement is that it's been overwhelmingly focused on rural places, but all of you guys organize in both, you've been in both rural places and organized in the city. And I'm wondering, I mean, the divestment movement seems like one of the ways that when you're in the city, you can organize around, you can like show your solidarity and help to strengthen rural movements. But are there other ways that we can like create tighter links between, I don't know, the rural and urban communities?
I mean, for me, I think it's an incredible opportunity to be in New York City, and it's one of the ways that people can affect change in this by their proximity to these big banks and these big institutions, which are here and not always in other places. So it's definitely an opportunity that we can be using. But I also want to kind of question the rural-urban divide, because it's not as if New York isn't also native land, and it's also not as if there aren't a lot of native people here. And so a lot of the struggles for indigenous sovereignty are also struggles that we kind of tend to forget that those are also happening in the city. And we stop thinking about the city as environment, actually. We stop thinking about our water and our land here as something that also, is under attack in various ways. And so I think a piece of it for me is, yes, going after the banks, yes, sort of using our proximity to those institutions to press and put pressure on them, but also to reach out and make sure that we're building connections with indigenous people on this territory and people who are displaced from this territory and the communities of color here who are battling things in a different kind of way. So I think it's a mistake to think about like the anti-pipeline fight as occurring in kind of other non-urban places, because it all ties back to spaces like this, where people are building pipelines so that we can continue to fuel the kind of lifestyle, the kind of environment we have in New York. So, the energy companies that are pushing these pipelines are using places like New York, cities like New York, as an excuse, as legitimation for the need for continuing to push these energy projects. And so I think we need to think a little bit about that as well, that these are not completely separate spaces. They're connected in all kinds of ways, and we need to sort of lean into those connections and not shy away from them.
Yeah, I can go. I mean, echoing all that. I think one thing that's interesting about New York, and not just New York City, but New York State, is that as we're looking toward the Trump administration, the hope for federal action is more or less shut down. And so increasingly people are looking toward states like New York, states like California, which are heavily blue, have moderately progressive governments. You can debate whether, you can consider Andrew Cuomo a progressive, probably not, but people who are willing to be pushed. And so in New York State, it seems like there's this really interesting moment now where Cuomo is sort of trying to make himself a progressive foil to Donald Trump, and that makes him sort of vulnerable to pressure from the left on issues like climate. And so there's a campaign I've been following a little bit. There may be folks here in the room who work on it, called New Yorker News, which is a coalition of about 140, I think, organizations who are pushing for a series of legislation which could be adapted to other places. And I think that's kind of the hope of places like New York and California in these next couple of years, is to start experimenting with what do good policies look like that can be pushed at the state level, and then hopefully before too long at the federal level as well.
I do feel that those kinds of strategies and those kinds of state-based strategies are important, or we wouldn't have been pursuing them, but I worry too a little bit about that turn, because I have seen many of the organizations that are fighting against pipelines legally starting to explore what a states' rights approach would look like for fighting pipelines in the absence of, as scary as it is to think about it, in the absence of provisions through the Clean Water Act or Clean Air Act that have traditionally been implemented by states, but are actually implementations of federal legislation and federal policy. And it's concerning to me because while I think that that's really important as a stopgap measure, I don't want to cede too much ground legally or ideologically to what's happening at the federal level as well, you know?
No, totally. And I think part of the idea is that, you know, it's very unlikely, I think, given the way Congress looks right now, given the way the executive branch looks right now, that we're going to get federal action. But seeing these state level fights and even municipal city fights as a way to start, you know, making these policies from the ground up, basically, figuring out, you know, what works, what can get popular support, and seeing that both as a site of mitigation, but also as a site for experimentation, to you know, not to cede it, to cede the national level at all, and of course continue a defense of institutions like the EPA, which are going to come under like increasing assault from within. Scott Pruitt has sued the EPA 14 times. But yeah, having states be a place where we can sort of be imaginative about what policy can look like.
And I think that that's incredibly important, but I do worry about places that don't have the benefit of a state administration that can be as, I hesitate to say easily, but can be pushed at all, as, you know, New York has. So you have pipelines crisscrossing, you know, natural gas pipelines crisscrossing the country in Florida, Ohio, Virginia, et cetera. And so I hope that you see the same kinds of, again, resources that have been directed towards places like New York. It's not like an accident that these are these places where there's pockets of strength. It has everything to do with where, you know, where organizational resources have gone.
Oh, exactly. I mean, President Obama, I think in 2012 maybe, said we needed all of the above energy strategy. I think now we need an all of the above resistance strategy for climate.
I mean, it seems like part of what a lot of these like local communities are pushing for are not just the ability to like stop pipelines, but to try to institute, you know, new systems or economies that would support renewable energy or support more equitable distribution of like energy resources or something. So I'm just wondering, are there, going forward, there's going to be a lot of just defensive action against like whatever the new administration keeps like throwing down the pipeline. But are there like models of land management or models of like, I don't know, local energy distribution that we can be looking towards? That we can be putting forward as like alternatives to the kind of system that exists right now?
Yes, I think yes is the answer. I mean, I think about the work that I've done out at Unistoten Camp, where they have members of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation have been permanently on their traditional territory for the past 7 years. Fighting pipelines, yes, but also building back cultural practices that have been lost, creating space and maintaining space where people can hunt and fish. So I think for a lot of these indigenous communities, especially, this is not just about actual physical survival, but about cultural survival. And one of the things that tends to surprise people about spaces like Unistoten is that there are a lot of non-native allies who come to that space and are welcomed into that kind of organizing. So it's not like an exclusive sort of movement.
Can you explain what Unistoten is?
Yeah, so the Unistoten clan is a clan of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, which is in northern British Columbia. They have returned to traditional territory and set up a series of cabins and structures along the GPS coordinates of proposed pipeline routes. And for the past 7 years have had permanent residents on that territory, members of the clan who've been out on the territory, also all sorts of other supporters who've come out to help. And they've successfully kept pipelines from entering that territory. And so they're on a sort of like energy corridor, what the energy companies are calling an energy corridor, and so have been able to use their positioning in that space to keep pipelines from going through there. But again, I think this comes back to the issue about it and not being necessarily just about a pipeline, but also about, you know, building the strength of communities and building alternatives and imagining a space actually where people can hunt and fish and engage in those traditional practices in ways that isn't going to damage their bodies because everything's so contaminated. So it's both about giving these communities the power to say no to projects, which is something that's been really lacking both in the United States and in Canada, is that, when it comes to consultation around pipelines and resource extraction, even though there might be some kind of consultation or negotiation that happens, Indigenous groups don't really have the right to say no under the legal structures that we have right now. So I think it's about, where, in places where it's possible to be supporting those kinds of movements that are about pipeline resistance, but also about land-based land-based resistance. They're about land defense, and that means not just stopping pipelines, but also like nurturing the kinds of practices that should be possible in those spaces. So I see that as a really important thing to say. It's not just a kind of negative movement. We're not just saying no to all of these things, but also actually building up the strength of communities by having spaces where people can relearn traditional practices and actually sustain themselves on their territories.
I would completely agree with the importance of having those alternatives on hand. When we were fighting a liquefied natural gas port that had been proposed for Long Island, one of the key arguments that we were making during that campaign is that this is where an offshore wind farm could be built for more jobs and better jobs, and to supply that area with energy. And we've since then, that was defeated in 2015, late in 2015. And, we had a panel on offshore wind in February of last year and, talking about alternative ways of providing our energy. And one of the gentlemen who we had on the panel was a member of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and he'd actually been a worker on the terrible, dirty peak power plants that we have in this city. We have, in case people don't know, 10 peak gas-fired power plants, all located in low-income communities and communities of color. And, he said, I was one of the people who built those. And we are in support of renewable energy. We want wind power. If I could be, going for something like that, that would obviously where I would want my labor and my time to go. And in the case of offshore wind, you have labor commitments and union commitments from a number of the developers. I also hear critiques and appreciate critiques that something like utility scale offshore wind replicates the kind of hub and spoke model of providing energy that we're kind of trying to move away from. So here in New York, there's other options such as community choice aggregation, community solar that I think are really exciting as well. There's lots going on here in New York.
What are those things? Can you sort of explain?
Sorry, yes, thank you. So in the case of community solar, you have people who are not homeowners, people who rent their apartments, being able to participate in the renewable economy by pooling their purchasing power. Community choice aggregation is very similar, but it happens at the municipal scale. So there's actually sort of an interesting wedding of consumer power and political power that happens with something like community choice aggregation.
And that would that maybe be something that could help deal with issues of energy justice in the city? Because right now, a lot of the places where you think of there being new big solar farms tend to be wealthier, maybe small town type places where they have the space for solar or wind farms, and these kinds of installations can tend to be a little bit more expensive on the front end to install.
Yes, absolutely. And I would definitely, shameless plug for the Energy Democracy Alliance, I would definitely look into the work being done by the Energy Democracy Alliance around this. The entire push that's going on right now in the utility system is creating a utility system that is renewable, equitable, accountable, and local. And I think that you're going to see more of that work becoming more obvious and, more visible over the next year.
Yeah, and I would agree with all of that. And just to go off a little bit more on the question of energy justice, some of the work that I've been really excited by is happening in things called renewable electric cooperatives, which were established in the 1930s as part of a New Deal program, actually. All of which, came from massive pressure from below, from organized labor, from citizens groups. And what they were responding to was the fact that right in the wake of the Great Depression, some 90% of rural homes lacked electricity, so just had no electricity at all. And so this was imagined as a way both to bring electricity and to have the electricity be owned by the people who were receiving it. And so it actually looks in sort of the way it operates a little bit like Germany's Energiewende, in that you have these cooperatives which are actually owned by ratepayers and were designed to be affordable. Were designed to give people power that they could actually use and not be priced out. And so looking at the renewable sector in the US, we actually face a somewhat similar problem, which is that as was mentioned, renewables can be very expensive right now, and the sector is dominated by private companies, by companies like Solar City, like Sunrun, and so we're facing a sort of gap that looks a little bit like the electricity gap that we had in the wake of the Great Depression, which is that many people still, solar is totally inaccessible to them, wind power is totally inaccessible to them, and so the rural electric cooperatives are an interesting model, and there's really interesting organizing happening there and treating them as sort of these strategic institutions, where most of them now run inordinately off of coal, are controlled by these sort of old boys networks, and what people are starting to do is run democracy campaigns within these cooperatives. In some cases, a cooperative will service an area that's predominantly black, and it will have a board that's entirely white, and they won't have elections. Those boards are appointed, have been the same networks of people for years and years and years. And so tying this work around energy democracy, bringing down rates, transitioning over to renewable sources, to projects for political power, to re-democratize structures and seeing this, if you think about a strategic plan as being to run for things like city council and school board, also running for rural electric cooperative boards, which have this kind of very material connection to how people get their power and how Americans get their power. I think it's something like 9% of Americans get their power through this. And so, yeah, having this kind of magical fusion of fight for political power as well as one for affordable, clean, renewable energy.
And I'm wondering if pushing for these things is actually a way to support some of these, rural and indigenous communities that are outside the city. Like, for instance, in Alberta, where the tar sands are, there's one like Lubicon Lake First Nation, which is like right in one of the tar sands regions. They have, started to install solar by themselves on their territory. I know that Cold Lake First Nation, another different tar sand region also in Alberta, they've talked about different ways that they can start to install solar to generate their own power, and it would just be gradually a process of just disentangling themselves, I guess, from like the fossil fuel economy. Yeah, do you guys think that this is maybe also a way to create stronger ties?
I think it's partially in response to those ties as well. It's not just Indigenous peoples on their own territories saying we don't want our territories to be contaminated by a pipeline spill, but also recognizing that those infrastructures link them to all sorts of other territories where people are facing fracking and the tar sands and those kinds of things as well. So I think it's a way of also honoring the connections and relations people have between different Indigenous communities in order to, stop the destruction on other territories as well. So I think, yeah, it's a great idea, and people are going either off grid or finding other ways to generate energy, and it could be a really strong solution to trying to disentangle and be accountable actually to not just our own communities, but others as well.
I guess, right, one final question since we're running out of time, and we want to get to questions from you guys. I guess this is just a very strange moment to be organizing, well, really against on any issue from the left. But in particular right now, I mean, you're seeing a crackdown on protests. I don't know if you guys caught, like in North Dakota, the new governor I think it was like a couple of days ago, he passed a bunch of new laws, basically in response to the DAPL protests. They were like, it's illegal to wear a mask or to mask your face if you're participating in protests. It gives them it gives the state broader rights to bring in out-of-state law enforcement officers to help them deal with protests. But then at the same time, it seems like trying to push for changes on the federal level are just going to be really, really difficult. And yet, like just the scale of the climate crisis, it also, I think it just means that like we can't just be dealing with, we can't just be working on this like hyper local level. So I'm wondering, I mean, this is a giant question, but like, what is like the best use of our energy right now, or what's the best way forward right now as organizers or people who think about this all the time?
Kate, you go for it.
Hey, thanks, Patrick. Wow, the best use of our time. Yeah, I mean, I think there's not less work than there was on November 7th. Yeah, I mean, I think basically it seems like there's a fight on two fronts right now. On the one is a defensive fight to ensure that we can keep, any of the protections that were extended during the Obama administration, as flawed as they might have been, to preserve basic institutions and rights, like the EPA, and just try to make sure that every sort of horrible campaign promises Trump has made gets met with just fierce opposition at every step along the way. And I think another is figuring out how do we actually create space in this horrifying political moment for imagination and for a real clear and unflinching demand for what we need. And I think part of the way that looks in the next couple of years is just to speak to something sort of specific, is looking for ways to take back political power in some ways and pursuing a sort of down ballot strategy that has been kind of in the air of progressive and left movements for a while, but I think is infused with a particular urgency when we think about the climate. Which is that we need state power in order to, get anywhere near the level of emissions reductions that we need, but not, doing this in sort of a top-down, bureaucratic way or in a way that's sort of directed from NGOs in Washington, but looking to who are the leaders who have been leading fights against extractive projects, who have been leading fights to kick fracking out of their communities, to kick the fossil fuel industry out of where they live, and seeing these as really the leaders that we need in this moment, who are waging again these defensive fights, but also are creating real transformative demands from where they are and informing this sort of broader political project with grassroots energy that isn't forming demands at a 40,000 feet level, but looking to what do communities need, both on climate and more generally. And I don't think seeing this as sort of a specifically climate-focused strategy is important, but part of the one of the worst things about climate is that it exacerbates all the other things. So as as we're fighting pipelines and such, also fighting these draconian immigration proposals that are coming down the line, and increasingly seeing these as issues which are very intimately tied in terms of how the administration itself thinks about them as being part of a very neat ideological project to have power held within as few people as possible and money held with as few people as possible, and also on a strategic level to think about the kind of coordination we need, the kind of power we need is not held singly in one movement, but looking at this as really a sort of united struggle, and seeing climate as putting a timeline on it, basically, around the urgency to unite these forces and to enact the sort of change that we need.
Yeah, I would completely agree in terms of amplifying many different movements at this point, right? And there may not be a single, silver bullet best kind of tactic. I do think that the following things are true, right? We aren't going to make the progress we need on climate under a Trump administration, and we also have to make progress on this issue. So from there, the questions become, what do we do? And the analogy that I heard that I think is interesting around how some tactics have worked in movements past was in 1963 in Birmingham. The violence and the reaction of Bull Connor managed to serve the purposes of polarizing the existing administration, but then what do you do when that figure, that opponent, is essentially is the president, right? And so the question then becomes, I think, figuring out which pillars are supporting that power, and which sectors can be turned. I think that some of the organizing happening around public sector employees is really interesting. I think that from an ideological perspective, organizing workers in the renewable energy industry becomes that much more important, right? Because it changes the kind of story that the regime is able to tell about itself. And to the extent that you can, keep showing up, get enough sleep, drink enough water, eat enough food, yeah.
I think just to follow up on that one of the things that becomes really important, especially when we're seeing the kind of violent crackdown on protests that we're seeing right now, is that we need to remember our histories and need to be paying attention to the fact that communities of color and indigenous communities have been resisting these movements for a long time, and have been criminalized in their protest for a long time. And so it isn't the first time, we can go back to the American Indian movement, we can go back to the Civil Rights movement. People were criminalized around their protests of an oppressive system all the way through this. So we're seeing a broadening of a kind of crackdown on forms of protest. And I think my push there would be, if you're a part of a community that hasn't really experienced that before, it's a time to listen to our elders and to work within the history that we know and what has been effective in the past as well. And part of that also, for me, is about adopting a diversity of tactics. There might be people who are well-positioned to be doing this at a higher political level, and there are people who are fighting out in the streets and doing that on the ground. And I think we need to be cautious when it comes to making sure that we're allowing those tactics to take place, because they're important. And there have been a number of communities, oppressed communities, marginalized communities, that have been doing this labor for decades. And longer, centuries, and that work needs to be honored and remembered, and also the people who are fresh to the fight and have energy for it. I think it's about taking care of yourself, but also recognizing what your position is and what forms of privilege you already have. And if it feels like a scary moment, it's because it is. But people have been through it, so I think that history is also very important to remember.
All right, so I think we will open up the floor to questions, but before we do that, I think the people from the Grassroots Action New York campaign are going to say a few words.
Yes. Is this, okay.
Can I stand or am I going to be like in the middle? Okay. All right. Hey, oh, this is really loud. Hey, everybody. I just wanted to, before I said anything, I just wanted to thank this amazing panel for coming out. I want to thank Verso for hosting this awesome event. And the New Inquiry, and Bronx Climate Justice North for also co-hosting and helping us organize this. So my name is Magena, and I am the co-chair of the grassroots organization, Grassroots Action New York. We're relatively, am I like in this at all? Okay. I don't want to be like, if people are watching this, I don't want to be like standing off to the side. So we're a relatively young organization. We've been around for about a year, and we're entirely volunteer run and like donation based, but basically we just do everything voluntarily and as much for free as possible. So that's like basically our group. And one of the really important tenets of our organization is that we want to fight issues from that are like systemic issues at the source, and we want to make all of the things that we focus on actionable. So, oh, I forgot my notes. So before we even decided to host this panel, like the reason we were going to have an event was purely just to kick off this project, but we were lucky enough to be able to get these amazing speakers to really like delve further into the issues that we're focusing on. But our group currently is working on a project to help people personally divest from banks funding the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I'm sure a lot of you, if you're like following that or at all, you're probably aware of the Defund DAPL movement. So we're working in coordination with them on personal divestment and citywide divestment right now. And the first action that our group is organizing is a personal divestment campaign. And I know a lot of people have thought about this, like maybe like pondered it, but it's kind of a daunting thing to think about, switching banks, and you know, it's all of your life savings, and it can seem really scary. So we're basically trying to break this down into simple, really easy tasks that everybody involved is going to do together, starting today, leading up to our day of action, which will be on March 18th. And we're all going to meet up to have a rally and go around to banks together to support each other as we all close our accounts, because at that point we will all be moved into better banks. So if you got the handout when they were on this table when you walked in, that kind of walks through the plan for our divestment project. And all of this is on a website that's also on this piece of paper, but it's basically the same information. So first of all, if you are interested in participating, you should look at the list of banks that are funding the Dakota Access Pipeline. All of them are on this paper, and the ones that are like the major funders are all listed at the top of the list. And if you haven't started to transition from your bank but are interested, now is the day to start if you want to do it with us. So after today, we're going to spend 1 week basically researching and figuring out where you want to move your money. And there's a list actually at the front of this room also of banks that we have pulled together from various resources, including some that have been provided by like the Defund DAPL group, that you can consider moving your money into. There's a lot of really awesome banks and credit unions around this city that you can bank at. And then we're going to give everybody 1 week in which we will all together open our accounts at our new banks. And so, and if you've already started this and you're ready to open your account, do it, Monday morning. That would be amazing. But just to make it easier for everyone, we're giving a week to make your decision, and then another week to find some time from Monday through Friday, just like put a note in your calendar, check the hours of the bank you're going to move to, and go and open that account. And that's all you have to do that week. And I mean, I've done this recently, because I was also banking at like Chase, and I was moving to a new bank, and it took less than an hour. You know, it was like not a big deal. So just, you know, that's the only thing you have to do that week. And then following that week, if you follow us on social media, or if you sign up on the form by the door, you'll get emails, and we're going to have one simple task every day to make sure that you're responsibly preparing to close your old account. And that's also, we also provided a checklist. So if you're not big on social media and you check your email once a month, you can also just use the paper form. So for example, like one day we're all going to switch our direct deposits, if you get one for work, to your new account. One day we'll switch all of our subscription services over, and move all of that information out of your over to your new bank. And so basically we're trying to make this as easy for people as we possibly can, so that it's easy and like quick, and you don't feel overwhelmed, because I think a lot of people are really interested in this idea, but they're just basically overwhelmed by the amount of tasks involved. And I think it's important to note that a lot of people are like, well, I don't really have a lot of money, so this doesn't, this can't really do anything. It doesn't make a big impact. But through personal divestment, so far, over $70 million have been moved out of the banks funding the Dakota Access Pipeline. And that's just since their website started having a tracker on it for people to put those amounts in when they switched banks. And that's, it's a drop in the bucket of the billions of dollars that are in these banks, but it's still very significant. And the more people that do it, the more other people get interested, and the more people that get involved. And this is like a first step action to getting businesses, corporations, and cities to follow suit. And that's when the pressure is really on to actually do something. For example, just this week, Alameda, California voted to divest $36 million from Wells Fargo. Earlier this month, Davis, California did the same, and most people have already heard, but the Seattle City Council is divesting $3 billion from Wells Fargo. And although there was a lot of involvement, like from politicians and organizers and the grassroots in doing these things, it's still, I think that the fire is lit when all of the, the base of the grassroots basically start things off. And so this is our chance to do it. Yeah, so this is Elle. Do you want to introduce yourself? Okay.
Sure. My name is Elle Kaplan. I'm the CEO of Lexion Capital Management. We're one of the only 100% women-owned asset management firms in the U.S. I'm here to talk to you a bit about basically how to be impactful with this. It was my sense that you really need to be the change, okay, that you seek. So quite simply, by voting with your wallet, which is ultimately why we're here. This is an issue of corporate greed, all right? So by moving your checking account, which is the bread and butter of any bank, you actually make a very big impact. And I'm going to politely disagree with the number of those steps. You should have a place to put your money right away. So you can find amazing credit unions that are FDIC insured. Your money will be safe. And another benefit from you, not only will you be able to divest, from supporting things that are not in your values, you'll actually make more money at a credit union. The interest rates are higher, all the terms are better. So it's a win-win. You're helping yourself ultimately. This is an absolute no-brainer, and everyone here should do it.
Maybe just give them like a website or something.
So we'll open it up for questions. Whoever wants to ask a question, I'll bring you the mic.
And just in the interest of time, could we maybe take 3 questions at a time and then have the panelists answer all of them together?
Great.
Hi. So the reason, the obvious reason that all these big NGOs are the ones that get the donations is that the smaller organizations don't necessarily have the resources to publicize what they're doing. So like, how do I, as someone who's willing to donate, like find out about these smaller organizations that maybe don't have the voice that the larger ones do?
This is half a question, half a wild cry for help. Your last question, Audrea, about the question of urgency. When I think and read and try to act, I'm so often completely flummoxed by the gap between what the actual urgency is vis-a-vis, say, that 1.5 degree warming or the 2.0 degree warming, versus the kind of discourse where we are starting things, we're moving things, we have a first step, we're forging relations, all of which are crucial, obviously, and inspiring, but I feel utterly split between my attraction to those things and what I know is the kind of urgency equivalent to having our hair on fire. And it strikes me that in general, the climate movement hasn't registered and responded to that urgency. So that's, I guess, a question for comment for the people. Thanks.
Thanks. To follow on to the last question from the panel, and focusing specifically on renewable energy generation, to what extent is that fight located in the utilities themselves, and to what extent should we be pushing on the utilities who we pay our energy bill every month, and to what extent is that, should our energies be directed towards local and federal government to make that a reality?
Do you guys want to?
Sure. I guess I'll just speak first to that question in particular. The Department of Public Service in different states is generally either legally or in practice controlled by the governor of that state, certainly here in New York. So the short answer to that question is push on the governor. And one other thing I just wanted to say as well to the question that was raised earlier, which I thought was a really important one around finding out about local battles and finding out about different grassroots groups. I can't speak for different states, but here in New York, we worked with our grassroots allies in putting together an online map. The You Are Here map, that's youareheremap.org. And that functions as sort of a clearinghouse for different anti-infrastructure groups all over New York and Pennsylvania.
Well, maybe I can speak to the question about urgency and response, and then also about where we could find places to put our money when it's, we're dealing with smaller organizations or non-organizations. And I think resources like that are a really good place to look. Also, it's just about finding out who is active in your own particular community. And they may not be necessarily originally about like climate justice, climate change, but I think reaching out to community groups that are, focusing on immigration right now, that are community defense groups that are pushing back against this Muslim ban, groups that are dealing with other forms of environmental degradation at the community level. That, for me, that's the place to start. Is that those people are feeling the urgency more than a lot of us, and I think digging into those community relationships also helps. At least has helped me. To to feel like there's a network of support, people who are in it for each other, and it kind of helps deal with the gravity of the situation. And I think that's just tending to those relationships is really important. And there might not be an organization that is specifically around these issues in your neighborhood, but there could be. If you start from the place of who's already organizing, who's doing the work already, who needs support, I think that's the place for me to start.
Yeah, not too much to add, but on the questions of urgency, I think, yes, like it's very urgent. Like we need to decarbonize the economy by 2036. How the hell do we do that? That's like a huge task. And keep 70% of fossil fuels in the ground. And so, in thinking about how to scale up renewable generation to the scale that we need, I think one, sort of partial answer to this, and people have written books about this question, of course, is to take it out of the private sector. I mean, I think the fact that most renewable generation is now reliant on private companies is very scary, and to not have public power generation as being the sort of top line demand of any kind of like push for renewables is I think it needs to be kind of at the forefront, and having it be not just reaching people who can afford to put solar panels in their homes, but making it affordable, making it widespread, accessible, and working the policy mechanisms that we need to do that, creating friendly policies for solar in different states, friendly policies for wind. And it gets very sort of like technical and wonky very quickly when you start talking about how to expand renewables. So if you're interested in that, I think Patrick is probably a good person to ask.
But it doesn't have to be, to start out, right? I mean, I think that's actually where your point is incredibly important. Just find out where the existing social infrastructure is in your area, and and go from there. And while it may feel like slow going, that is the surest path, I think, from where I'm sitting.
I might just follow up on that really briefly, that one of the things that I found really important doing this kind of organizing is to also just evaluate where you're at and what your strengths are. Some people excel at the big picture policy thinking, and if that's your jam, then like definitely be thinking about how we get out of carbon-based industry before 2036. And for some people, that is really overwhelming, and I think that's really okay. And there are other places to be putting your energy. You don't have to do all of it at once. And it's really worth supporting grassroots movements, even if you don't have the answer to, continuing to find other renewable sources, that, other people are doing that work. And so it's about finding where you have energy and where you have strength, and then pushing on those movements so we don't all like burn out horribly.
So thank you for a wonderful panel. And I would just say in response to the question about urgency, that one of the things we all can do, and this often isn't addressed by panels like this because our focus so often tends to be on the energy sector and energy alone, is agriculture and food. If we all were vegetarians or vegans in this room, that would go actually a long way towards combating climate change. So, and I'm just wondering what the panel would say about sort of non-energy sector areas and how we could be pushing, in those areas.
Yeah, and I had a kind of a question, I guess, for Patrick and Kate, based on some of the talk around like scaling and new infrastructure projects. And alternative energy sources. I'm just kind of thinking about the work that the No DAPL camps have been doing, and the kinds of claims to recognize Native self-determination. They're based on this longer history of infrastructure projects in the Missouri River Basin. So like all those dams that were constructed in the 1950s and 60s, which were to provide energy for settlers, right, ended up flooding 90% of like agricultural timberland that was used by the Great Sioux Nation. So how do we like kind of think about or like productively work through this tension between decolonizing needs, right, to like return land, to acknowledge self-determination of Native nations, while also trying to meet the energy needs of people who are here, people who are oppressed, people who are, like feeling the impacts of environmental racism?
Hi, thank you so much. So I was wondering what the panel thought, what sort of space disaster planning might take in the current administration, and if that feels like too much of a black box, then what you think, whether or not you think disaster planning is a useful framework to address climate issues.
To the question that you raise about the legacy of settler violence in providing for these larger generation resources, I think that that's incredibly important, and it's not just mirrored in terms of how we're discussing new generation, but also in terms of the claims to land ownership that I'm seeing happening in the anti-infrastructure movement as well. So there is there's an important movement right now in places where language around land ownership is more productive, perhaps, in terms of reaching a broad audience to go after the power of eminent domain that some of these big energy companies have to basically seize land and, trample over, the homes of the people who live there. And so there's an obvious tension there too, right? There's an obvious problem to be worked through where it's like, yes, obviously giant energy companies shouldn't have a say in what happens on land where people live, right? But it also creates this, it glosses over the history of taking land from native people there as well. And so that doesn't answer that question necessarily, but I just wanted to point out that that's something that's not unique to that area. I think one perhaps interesting model is the model that Kate was describing before of the rural electrical cooperatives, which are a fascinating case study in how people are taking power into local hands and working with local planning processes as well, like what you were mentioning before. And there's that work happening all over. It's not necessarily the work that's getting into the front page of the newspapers because it's not as it doesn't necessarily register as sort of, groundbreaking or exciting, but it is, and it's happening all over the country.
I guess this is a question for Anne. Could you elaborate a little bit more about Indigenous leadership? And I'm thinking in terms of, using Standing Rock as an example, on the one hand, you have Dave Archambault, the tribal chairman, and then you have like Chase Iron Eyes and LaDonna Brave Bull. So who is the leadership there? And even when I was out there was places like the Red Warrior camp, and they, as you know, advocated something totally different. So it's sometimes kind of difficult to know who's in charge of the tribe, who is the tribal leadership, and what is the validity of the tribal councils? Because a lot of people say that they're really just there to enforce what the government wants to enforce, as opposed to the traditional idea of leadership coming from the people. And there's, what I'm talking, okay?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really tricky question, and it's going to be different in each place you look where Indigenous leadership is aiming for self-determination and sovereignty over territory. Part of that is because of the violence done by the imposition of political systems on Native nations that were organized in different kinds of ways. And so in some places, yes, the tribal councils are experienced by people in those spaces as an imposition of the federal government. This is, I think especially true in Canada, where it's the imposition of the Indian Act. There's particular legislation that governs how Indigenous people are meant to interact and negotiate with the state and who has the capacity to do so. I think it's important. I mean, it's hard on the ground, and I had the same struggle on the ground at Standing Rock to figure out who was really in charge. I think it's also about not expecting particular Indigenous leadership to speak for all of Indigenous Indigenous people or all of the people who are fighting for sovereignty, but to kind of recognize the different constraints on people's actions in different places. And so I think that, what has emerged at Standing Rock is, there are two ways of looking at the fight and the goals of the fight. For Dave Archambault, it's been, he's always advocated a reroute, right? And LaDonna rejects the reroute and also the idea of pipelines existing at all, right? And you can see how people have been forced into situations, and tribal leadership has been forced into situations where, in order to get some sort of modest gains for their people, they have to play this kind of political game where they accept a concession like a reroute as something that's an acceptable answer. Those tensions are present in any Native nation I've ever experienced. And so I think it's also just about how do we support a grassroots movement? How do we support people with that kind of diversity of tactics that I was talking about earlier, things like Red Warrior Camp alongside the tribal council. And I think it's about figuring out where you stand with those questions while not digging into the discord, the political discord that can be happening in these places. I think it's really important as people who are outside these communities to not really push on the political disagreements, because we can see them as historical violences, right? That the existence of a tribal council and the legitimation of particular structures of governing is a historical imposition. And so we can see that. It's still hard to figure out who to follow, right? And there's not going to be like one answer, like this one person has all of the answers as to how to, correctly be in relation to land and territory. But I think it's about asking ourselves just a general question. And I think most Indigenous movements for sovereignty and people who are involved in that would agree with this, that it's less about figuring out who to follow necessarily as it is trying to figure out how do we, as individuals and as communities, remake our relationships to land and water in ways that are less destructive. And I think both Dave and LaDonna are trying to do that work, but they're facing different kinds of constraints based on their position within that tribal organization. And so that's going to be different in each place we look. And it's a completely different kettle of fish when we're also looking at tribes that don't have national recognition. They're federally recognized tribes and non-federally recognized tribes. All of that gets really complicated, but I think part of it's just knowing the history of that system and then trying to figure out where you best fit in terms of the actions you can offer and what you can offer to the movements. There's like a million pages of reading we could do to actually understand how those things are working politically. We've compiled a set of resources called the Standing Rock Syllabus, which is a whole resource packet that you can look at for readings on the history of these places. And that can, for me at least, that helps try to figure out like how to navigate it on the ground. So what is the structure that's been imposed? What are the politics of these spaces? What's the history of like colonial violence and colonial land management, these kinds of things. I think reading into that in the place that you're thinking about making an intervention can be a really helpful thing so that you don't totally misstep. But it's like super complicated. Yeah, but thank you for that question.
Anyone else?
Yeah, we didn't answer a couple of questions. Does anyone want to jump in about agriculture or?
Yeah, I can take that. And maybe to go a little bit to the question you asked as well about these infrastructure projects and what a blight they've been on so many communities. So the first one I would say, admittedly, my sort of like micro focus is on energy, and so there are probably other people who are better equipped to answer this question than I am. But I think one thing that kind of stands out to me when thinking about consumption is that wealthy people are terrible consumers. Wealthy people are terrible for the planet, and having folks with inordinate levels of wealth is really awful. If you look at a map of New York, there was a friend of mine, Danielle Donna Cohen, compiled this map where he, along with somebody who makes maps, there's a word for that, and it looked at the city of New York and mapped out each neighborhood by carbon emissions, factoring in many different factors, including what people are buying, where things they buy are coming from, how they move around the city, and the sort of most high polluting area of the city was like Midtown Manhattan. And some of the lowest polluting areas of the city were places where there's very dense public housing, and these are by and large working class areas of the city. And I think one of the morals to sort of draw from that is like there's layers to this stuff, and that part of the consumption problem, I think, is addressing, how sort of vastly unequal this is. And then I think there's a sort of generalizing way we can think about consumption is that, all of us in the United States are consuming so much. And actually, it falls in very particular ways, which is that wealthy folks, by and large, tend to just consume a lot more and are worse for the planet. I mean, most of us aren't getting in private jets and don't own yachts. And so folks who don't do that probably can worry a little bit less about, how much like canned soda they buy or something like that. So yeah, and to the question of like, but yeah, just to affirm that kind of consumption is an important level of focus, and there are folks doing sort of excellent work on that. And then to these infrastructure projects, yeah, I mean, I think I spoke earlier about the need to take renewable generation out of the private sector, but as we're putting it into the public sector, I think just as important is democratizing the state and making sure that the folks making decisions about where these things go are folks who are impacted. And so, if that land, making sure that the folks who have a rightful claim to that land, who in many cases are indigenous folks, have a say over not just where things are built, but who is benefiting from it. Where are folks getting jobs? Are they outsourcing jobs from outside of the state? Are the profits going? Where are the profits going for these sorts of things, and ensuring that the actual community who is there where these things are being built have a say in that, because I think we do need large-scale projects on the scale of dams, but should really learn from history in terms of who gets hurt when these sorts of projects are just sort of parachuted into places where they may not make sense, and giving communities who are going to be impacted by that a really upfront say, not just in a sort of last-minute consulting phase, but in a very early ground level place.
There was a interesting case study, actually, given the topic of this panel, in a commercial that pioneered in the late 70s, early 80s, I think, that was called the Crying Indian commercial, even though the person who was hired for that role was not a native person. But are people familiar with that commercial? Show of hands. So this was sort of a large-scale television commercial to raise awareness around not littering. And that commercial was paid for entirely and pioneered by the plastic container industry, because they recognized that there was growing momentum around resource streams, and they wanted to keep people's attention focused on the 7% of recycling and waste, or the 7% of waste that happens at the consumer side of the life cycle, and rather than the 93% of waste that happens at the manufacturer end of the life cycle. And I bring that up not at all to disparage, going vegetarian or vegan. I think it's a wonderful thing, and I think that people should do it. But I also want to recognize that our lifestyle choices will not bring us to liberation, and the choices that we have on offer, we're not going to buy ourselves to where we need to be.
Just to clarify, I didn't mean it as a consumption question exactly, because the meat industry globally has to do with not just consumption, but production and all the rest of it. I'm done. It's much more than just consumption.
Totally.
And lifestyle.
Totally.
Yeah.
If there are no other questions, I had one, which was, sorry, hogging the mic. How do we prepare for the worst, knowing that rich people will be able to protect themselves and defend themselves, as Trump is doing himself? But how do we prepare for the worst in terms of the communities most affected, and what can we do to anticipate what is likely to come? Not to be a bummer or anything.
I mean, well, this doesn't apply to everyone, I don't think, but I would say support. This is going to sound like a super survivalist kind of thing, but support groups that that are doing land-based pedagogy, that are taking youth and children onto the land, that are teaching people skills that are about survival and also self-determination and self-sufficiency. I think those are really important. People should be learning how to garden, like actual tangible skills like that. I think we can be doing skill sharing at a community level, and that can happen in New York as well, so that we sort of have spaces and community support. I think part of it's not about like kind of turning in to ourselves to figure out how we're individually going to survive, but also about reaching out to each other and figuring out how we keep our communities alive. Self-defense also. Yeah, sorry, that's like super survivalist. I'm like, okay,
No, I would
like
totally
I'm running
agree.
away to the bush. I don't know what everyone else is doing, but.
Just to speak to that, I have a lot of skills to learn, I guess. I think one thing is recognizing kind of, if we carry out the Trump's agenda to its sort of like most extreme, one impact is like horrible sort of climate impacts, but another impact is, how that sort of overlaps with what we've seen in the early days of this administration, which is a further criminalization of Black and brown folks. And so climate makes everything worse. I think Trump similarly makes everything worse, and those two fused together is uniquely terrifying. But in thinking about, what is the worst case scenario, and even levels of warming that we're already on track for, and that are already likely to happen by the end of the century, really not thinking of a climate as just something which has to do with, bringing down emissions, but also how are, we dealing with influxes of folks who have to leave the places where they lived for centuries because they're unlivable, which is already happening and will continue to happen, no matter how much progress we can make. And so, thinking of adaptation, not just in terms of, building seawalls and these infrastructure projects which are needed and learning sort of valuable skills, regrounding and the way we relate to the land as people, but also in thinking about what are policies we can be, pushing for and work in communities we can uplift that will make sure that when the shit hits the fan, for lack of a better word, with climate, we're not dealing with a sort of hyper-militarized, incarceratory, that's not a word, there's a word, a state that is even more sort of punitive than the one we live in now, which I think is one of the most sort of scary things to think about, is that, as rich people are protecting themselves, they're also, making sure that other people are not protected, enforcing low levels of consumption, doing, exacerbating the things we've already seen on a sort of dystopian scale.
The only thing I would add to that is I think that that's a reason why it's important right now, before things get there, to oppose the carceral state and be talking about this as an issue that is both a climate issue and one that is at sort of the root and at the heart of our economy in many different ways, so that we are not, like, the administration is going to keep reframing who does or does not deserve to be in prison.
Yes.
And I think both moral and practical call there is to talk about prison abolition as a component of a climate platform.
And I would just add to that too that that fits really well within a divestment platform, that a lot of the banks and other organizations that are funding the pipelines are the same ones that are funding private prisons, that we can think about this that these coalitions on a broader level in terms of divestment as well. And that the work we do also to take the criminalization element out of the narratives we tell, I think, especially when it comes to protest and protest tactics, we need to really resist the narrative that there are legitimate ways to protest and illegitimate ways to protest, because that is feeding into the criminalization of protest at a broader scale. And so I think this is also about like dialing back the peace policing at the protests that we're seeing, and also taking money out of the various sectors that are funding destruction in all these different ways, in prisons, in border infrastructure, in pipelines as well.
All right, so I think we're going to wrap up. I want to thank all of the panelists for speaking to us, and thank you all for coming. Do you have a couple things you want to say?
I was just thanks for spending your Saturday night here with us. And if you have any more questions about Grassroots Action NYC, please take their literature and come talk, and please come talk to Elle. And Majena, I just wanted to also see if you had anything you wanted to say to wrap up.
Just remind everyone, or there's a couple people that came in a little late, that if you are interested in just like even if you're not at all involved right now, if you're super involved, either way, if you're interested in taking the first step of getting involved in the divestment movement, please come see Elettra over here. She has great little pamphlets of all our information and can tell you more. And also, she helped spearhead the project to make these really amazing little like mini zines that you can give to somebody that has absolutely no idea what I'm talking about right now, just to like start spreading the word and starting to influence people beyond this circle. So just on your way out, make sure to sign in if you're interested in participating. And even if you're not, please take a bunch of the zines. Thanks, guys.